What a great way to start a Tuesday evening. T-Rex and Children of the Revolution on ABC Radio Hobart and ABC Northern Tasmania. If you were listening this time last week, you might have heard a conversation I had with author Aidan Phelan about Tasmanian bushrangers. One of the things which especially struck me during the conversation was just how many bushrangers were active in Tasmania during the early days of European colonisation. Needless to say, it seemed like the perfect opportunity to welcome Aidan back to the show to find out more about bushranger activity in Tasmania between 1820 and 1840. Aidan Phelan is the author of Glenrowan. He also runs the website A Guide to Australian Bushranging, and I'm reliably told that along with being a bushranger enthusiast, he has the beard to match. Hello, Aidan.
Hello, how are you going?
I'm very, very well. How were bushrangers viewed by the general public between 1820 and 1840?
That's a very good way to intro the section. By and large, they were quite feared. When you had Brady's gang going around at the beginning of the 1820s, they actually got to a point where in Hobart, the locals were all forming a sort of night watch, and they were out in the streets every night trying to make sure they were protecting the town from the bushrangers.
Goodness.
So, yeah, it was very worrying to a lot of the population, as obviously Tasmania at that time was still sort of growing, and the more that these bushrangers were out and about, the scarier it was for the people who were just trying to make an honest living.
Would it be accurate, and I don't mean to put words in your mouth, but would it be accurate to describe Hobart town at that period as something of a frontier town?
It's a bit of an interesting perspective. I'd say you would call it a frontier town, but it was actually quite a lot more built up than what perhaps people realise. A lot of the old brick buildings, so the commissariat store and the jail and things like that by that time were very well established, and they were more like what you would have seen back home in England. So though it was on the frontier, it actually was much more modern than what people may initially think.
And you mentioned the name Matthew Brady. When I was a young person, from my recollections of stories of bushrangers, certainly at high school, I was always under the impression that Matthew Brady got something of a rough deal. Was that the case? What was his story?
Brady is a fascinating character, and the more I learn about him, the more I want to know. He started off as a groom back in England, and apparently he was involved in a bit of forgery, and that's why he ended up being brought over to Australia. But while he was in the convict barracks and things like that, he was a bit of a rabble-rouser, and it ended up getting him about 500 lashes in total. And because he didn't like that very much, he conspired with a group of other convicts to steal a whale boat. They were over there at Sarah Island, and they were given sort of light duties because they had been behaving themselves. And while all the officials and everyone were over there looking at what was going on, they snuck off, they stole the boat, and they effectively circumnavigated the western part of Tasmania to get back up into the Derwent River. And from then on, they just sort of ran around stealing things from some of the wealthier farms and individuals in the regions between sort of Hobart and Launceston, and even over into the Western Tiers to some degree.
What do we know about his gang?
A lot of them were very sort of minor criminals before they joined him. Much like Brady himself, a lot of them had sort of been brought over on relatively minor charges, but were very brutally treated. And so they all were sort of bound together, as it were, by that sense of hardship. But very quickly, the forces of law and order were able to catch up with them, and within a few months, most of the gang had already been taken. So you only really had Matthew Brady and James McCabe left, and they were a bit of an odd couple. Brady was very level-headed and gentlemanly, whereas McCabe had a bit of a wild side. He liked to drink, and he was not necessarily the kind of guy who would stick by you when things got tough. It was actually an incident where they were visiting a sympathiser, or who they thought was a sympathiser. His name was Thomas Kenton, and he usually provided them with information and he helped them to plan out their robberies. But because he was getting a lot of undue attention from the authorities, he decided that he would turn on them. And so Brady and McCabe and a friend of theirs named Haidt went down to Kenton's house, and as they got to the door, they were pounced upon by some soldiers. Now, McCabe, being the staunch friend that he was, promptly bolted off into the bush, so he managed to escape. But Brady and Haidt were captured, and Brady was quite badly beaten. So while the soldiers were taking Haidt into town, Brady was kept with Kenton, and he was all tied up, and he said to Kenton, "Oh, I'm not feeling very well. Do you mind if I have a lay down on the bed?" So Kenton puts him on the bed. He says, "Oh, I think a spot of tea might make me feel a bit better." So as Kenton went out to get some water, Brady jumped up, he put his hands in the fire to burn away the ropes around his wrists, and he got his musket. So when Kenton came back, he was at gunpoint, but Brady said, "I'm not going to shoot you. Just remember that the next time I see you, I may not be so lenient." And Brady took off. And he ended up working with McCabe again for a while, but not too long, unfortunately.
You're listening to ABC Radio Hobart and ABC Northern Tasmania. It's 7:19. My name's Paul McIntyre and my guest is author Aidan Phelan, who is the author of Glen Rowan. He also runs the website A Guide to Australian Bushranging. I'm told, Aidan, you also have a very impressive beard. And Aidan, you mentioned, in talking about McCabe and Brady, do we know much about their appearance? Were they the sort of blokes that as soon as you saw them, a chill might go down your spine and you wouldn't want to cross them?
Funnily enough, Brady and McCabe are two of the bushrangers we actually have good likenesses of, because there was an artist named Thomas Bock who took sketches of them while they were on trial. And when you look at the images, they actually look like quite fresh-faced young men. Matthew Brady himself was only in his mid-20s and he had quite solid features, but he looked like someone that was probably more likely to be a clerk or a bank manager or something like that. McCabe had very thin features, a very pointy nose, and they didn't at all look like the sort of people you would expect to be going around bailing people up in the bush. And that was part of the reason why they had such a strong following, was that they weren't your typical kind of ruffians.
Were they popular in terms of, I guess, a certain amount of the public maybe feeling a little bit of sympathy for them because Brady at least wasn't your typical ruffian? Absolutely.
There were sympathisers and harbourers everywhere. And in fact, there was a family in Bothwell who were considered to be quite respectable. And they were very well known amongst certain classes of people to be harbourers of Brady and his gang. And it wasn't until well after Brady was executed that it was found out what he'd been doing, and he ended up being sort of thrown into disrepute over it. But because they did have that sort of more gentlemanly reputation, they actually had quite a lot of supporters all over the state.
How did Brady and McCabe's rebellion, if you like, how did their bushranging antics come to an end?
Unfortunately for them, it was quite unpleasant. McCabe had left the gang because he got into an argument. What had happened was they'd gotten into a raid, and while they were in camp, there'd been a drunken brawl, as McCabe was very fond of the rum, a little too fond, and in the crossfire, the person that they'd captured had been killed. So Brady's response was to destroy all of the liquor. McCabe didn't like that, so he left. And as he went all the way through Bothwell and the Hamilton area, he ended up losing all of his supplies, and he turned on some of the harbourers and ended up being captured pretty quickly. Meanwhile, Brady was still undergoing all of his usual tricks, and some members of the fraternity of turncoats, I suppose, were infiltrating, and gradually Brady's gang was broken up and he was captured just outside of Ben Lomond. and he had actually gone onto a property that was owned by John Batman. Now, the story goes that Batman captured him single-handedly, but that's not actually the case. Batman had a little group with him that were keeping an eye out for Brady, and because Brady was very severely wounded in the leg and suffering from an infection, he didn't put up much of a fight. So they were all sort of taken into Launceston and tried and found guilty of their various crimes. In fact, Brady refused to plead not guilty to any of the charges laid at his feet, even the ones that he didn't do. And they were hanged, unfortunately for them, but maybe not so much for some of the people who were very afraid of the bushrangers at the time.
Was there any push from the public around Tasmania to at least have some sympathy for Brady?
There was a little bit. The story goes that, in particular, it was the women who had quite a soft spot for Brady. And in his cell towards the end, just before he was executed, his cell was absolutely brimming with gifts from women all over the colony, sending him flowers and sweet treats to sort of, I suppose, sweeten his time left on the earth. I suppose it says a lot about someone like Brady that, despite being one of the most feared men in the colony, he was also one of the most beloved.
Do you think there was ever a chance that there was going to be leniency expressed towards him?
Absolutely not. The forces of law and order at the time were very, very strict against any kind of offender. At that point, there were so many offences that could land someone on the gallows that it was almost impossible for someone to make an honest living once they had that kind of convict stain on them. And with the case of Brady, even if he'd turned himself in, it would have been straight to the gallows.
For people that have grown up like myself, I guess, sort of knowing the name Matthew Brady and knowing that he was a bushranger, but not necessarily a lot of detail about why he became a bushranger or his past before he arrived in Tasmania, how do you think the Tasmanian public, I guess, should regard him?
He's a very complex figure. I think that's one of the key things. And in a way, he represents both that rebelliousness of the convict class, but also that resourcefulness of the settler class, the people who are out there on the frontier, adapting to the land and trying to make a go of it. His ability to kind of morph with the land that he was inhabiting and be able to survive for long periods without having to rob farms or anything like that, I think that really reflects the almost ingenuity of some of the settlers and even the convicts who, once they were emancipated, had to try and live off the land.
And who were some of the other bush rangers who were especially active during the 1820s and up until the 1840s?
We actually had quite a long list of minor bushrangers, but perhaps the most well-known is the gang that was run by Samuel Britton. That was sort of 1830 to 1835 that they were at large, and as with most bushranger gangs, the membership changed a little bit. It started off with Britton and a chap named John Bevan, who was known as Big Jack, and they engaged in some kind of roughhousing and stealing firearms, that sort of thing. At one point, they broke into the female factory at Georgetown and were trying to liberate some of the inmates. And one of the guards there was shot in the attempt. They did manage to succeed in getting one of the women out, but she wasn't with them for very long before she was recaptured. Bevan sort of branched off on his own for a little bit. He had a farm where he was hiding out, and as a way of keeping his stay, he would go out and steal cattle for the guy who ran the farm and slaughter it for him. But eventually, there was a fellow named Hall who infiltrated that gang, and he shot Bevan for the reward. And when he was later found guilty of sheep stealing, because he had that background and he had friends in high places, not only did he get a free pardon, he was actually given a job as a constable.
Really?
Yeah, so that sort of gives you a sense of the class of people that were getting those sort of positions at that time. It wasn't as regimented as police force is now.
Aidan Phelan, I suspect there are a great many more characters left to talk about from that period. If it's okay, I might suggest that maybe we continue this conversation next week and explore perhaps in full the stories of some more Tasmanian bushrangers. And the reason I say that is because a couple of texts have come in, one of which I'd particularly like you to help me fill in from Liz. But first, the text from Graham, who has texted in on 0438 922 936. Graham says, a friend of my father's in Colebrook was broken into by Martin Cashpool. They called that room the Martin Cash Room. And that's from Graham. And Liz asks, and Aidan, if you're able to fill this in, and I know it's a question without notice, but Liz has written, hi there, I just drove past Brady's Lookout outside of Launceston. Can you tell us about that?
I can actually. I've been up there. I was there earlier this year. It's a lovely, lovely spot, just on the Tamar. And what I know of that area is that while the gang was on the run, that lookout provided a very important part of the landscape for them because they could see all the way up and down the river who was coming and going. And while the gang was hiding out there was a little bit of a discussion because there was a brig just offshore. And Brady wanted to go and capture the brig so they could leave Van Diemen's Land. He didn't know how to sail a boat or a brig, but he wanted to give it a red-hot go. And they got as far as getting in a boat and going to the brig, but then some of the other men got cold feet and they had to turn back.
Wow. What a fantastic story.
Hmm.
Aidan Phelan, I very much look forward to having a chat with you, hopefully around about this time next week, and find out some more about perhaps some lesser-known bushrangers from the 1820s through to the 1840s, if you'll be in it.
It would be my pleasure.
Excellent. Aidan Phelan, author of Glenrowan, and the man who also runs a website, A Guide to Australian Bushranging. Thank you very much for your time this evening. Great to talk to you, and I very much look forward to our next session.
Thank you for having me on.
My pleasure. You're listening to ABC Radio Hobart and ABC Northern Tasmania. It's 7:30.